All right, buckle up everyone, because today we're diving into one of the oldest stories ever told. Genesis 1, the very beginning of the Bible. Now, whether you're a believer, an atheist, or just someone who's curious about what all the fuss is about, we're putting this ancient text under the microscope. We're not here to sugarcoat it. We are here to ask the tough questions, the ones that have been dodged for millennia. Genesis 1 kicks off with, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." Pretty iconic, right? It sounds grand, poetic, almost magical. But here's where it gets messy. As we start unpacking the verses, the cracks begin to show. And no, I'm not just talking about vague language or cultural differences. I'm talking about blatant inconsistencies, logical puzzles, and some pretty questionable storytelling choices. Let's talk about those glaring contradictions between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. In chapter 1, we're given this neat, orderly sequence at day 1. Light, day 2. Sky, day 3. Land and vegetation, day 4. Sun, moon, and stars, day 5. Sea creatures and birds, day 6. Animals, and finally humans. But when we flip the page to Genesis 2, it's like someone lost the script. Suddenly we have man being created first, before plants, before animals, and bizarrely, before woman. You've got to wonder, did the writers forget what they wrote just one chapter ago? And it doesn't stop there. Let's zoom in on one of the most mind-boggling details, the creation of light, according to Genesis 1. God creates light on day 1, but, and here's the kicker, the sun, moon, and stars don't show up until day 4. Think about that for a second. How do you have light without a source? It's like saying you baked a cake without flour, eggs, or an oven. Sure, maybe there's some divine magic at play, but if we're being honest, it doesn't add up. Now I know what some of you might be thinking. Maybe it's not meant to be taken literally. Maybe it's just a metaphor, and hey, fair point. But if we go down that road, we have to ask, which parts are metaphor and which parts aren't? If the light is symbolic, then what about the firmament, that dome that supposedly separates the waters above from the waters below? Are we supposed to take that literally? Because last time I checked, there isn't a cosmic water balloon hanging over our head. Speaking of the firmament, let's talk about that for a minute. Genesis 1, verses 6 through 8, describes this expanse that God creates to separate the waters. It's a fascinating concept. But it's also completely out of sync with what we know about the universe. The idea of a solid dome might have made sense to ancient people who didn't have telescopes. But today, it's about as scientific as believing the Earth is flat, and yet this is the framework, pun intended, for the entire creation narrative. Now let's circle back to the big contradiction, the timeline of creation in Genesis 1. Humans are created last as the crowning achievement of God's word. But in Genesis 2, man is created first, then the plants, then the animals, and finally woman. It's like two different authors were competing for the best origin story, and instead of picking one, the editors just mashed them together. Scholars have long speculated that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 come from two different sources, written by different authors at different times. Genesis 1 is often attributed to the priestly source, which was all about order and structure. Genesis 2, on the other hand, is usually linked to the Yahweh source, which has a more personal, down-to-earth vibe. That's true. Then, what we're reading isn't a unified account of creation. It's a patchwork of competing narratives stitched together into a single text. And that brings us to the ultimate question. If Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 can't agree on something as fundamental as the order of creation, how much of it can we trust? If these chapters are supposed to be divinely inspired, shouldn't they at least be consistent? Or is it possible that these stories were never meant to be taken as literal history, but rather as myths crafted by ancient people trying to make sense of the world around them? But hey, don't just take my word for it. Crack open a Bible, read it for yourself, and see what you think, because whether you see Genesis as sacred scripture, historical fiction, or something in between, one thing for sure, it's a story that's been told and retold for thousands of years, and it's not going away anytime soon. Let's talk about something that's absolutely mind-bending in Genesis 1, the creation of light. Specifically, we're going to unravel the wild logic behind how light shows up on day 1. But the sun, moon, and stars don't get created until day 4. Now, this isn't just a quirky detail. It's a major plot twist that's got people scratching their heads for centuries. So let's break it down. Genesis 1 verse 3 says, "And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." Simple, right? Light pops into existence, and suddenly we've got day and night. But here's the kicker. Where is this light even coming from? There's no sun yet, there's no moon, no stars, nothing. It's like turning on a flashlight in a universe that hasn't even been wired for electricity. So what gives? Some people try to explain this by saying, well, maybe it's divine light, like some kind of supernatural glow that doesn't need a source. Okay, cool idea. But if that's the case, then why bother creating the sun later? If God already had this magical light thing going on, why complicate things with celestial bodies? It feels like over-engineering, doesn't it? Imagine if you invented a self-driving car that worked perfectly, and then 3 days later you decided to add a steering wheel for no reason. Why? Now let's get a bit nerdy with science for a second. We know that light, as we understand it, is electromagnetic radiation. It's emitted by sources like the sun, stars, and even artificial things like light bulbs. But in Genesis 1, we're being asked to accept the existence of light without any of these sources. It's like having rain without clouds, music without sound waves, or an ocean without water. Sure, it makes for an interesting story, but it's not how reality works, at least not in any way we've ever observed. And here's another twist. Genesis 1 verse 5 says that God separated the light from the darkness, calling the light day and the darkness night. So we've got a full-on day-night cycle happening on day 1. But again, no sun. How do you have a day and a night without a spinning Earth orbiting a sun? It's like writing a symphony where the instrument don't exist yet. The whole concept feels, well, backward. Some apologists argue that the light of day 1 might refer to something metaphorical, like God's presence or divine order. But if that's the case, why does the text go out of its way to talk about day and night? Those are literal, measurable phenomena. If this is all supposed to be symbolic, it's a pretty confusing way to say it. It's like writing a cookbook that lists feelings of joy as an ingredient. Great sentiment. But how do you actually make the dish? Now let's fast forward to day 4. When God finally gets around to creating the sun, moon, and stars. Genesis 1, verse 14 tells us these celestial bodies are put in place to separate the day from the night and to serve as signs to mark sacred times, days, and years. Wait a minute. Weren't day and night already separated back on day one? So what exactly is the sun doing here? And what about the stars? According to modern science, stars are basically giant nuclear reactors scattered across the universe, and our sun is just one of them. The idea that they were created after Earth and not the other way around is a complete reversal of what we know about astrophysics. In reality, stars formed billions of years before Earth even existed, and their remnants are what helped create the elements that make up our planet. But in Genesis, Earth gets VIP treatment, showing up first like it's the headliner of the universe. Talk about geocentric bias. Let's not forget the moon. Genesis 1, verse 16 calls it a great light. But anyone who passed third-grade science knows the moon doesn't produce light. It reflects sunlight. Yet the text seems to treat it as its own independent source of illumination, which is, let's just say, scientifically awkward. What's even more fascinating is that this whole sequence, light first, celestial bodies later, isn't unique to Genesis. Similar ideas appear in ancient Near Eastern myths, like the Babylonian creation story, where light and order emerge before the sun and stars. So was Genesis 1 drawing inspiration from these earlier tales? It's possible, and if that's the case, it raises even bigger questions about the original deity of the biblical account. Let's dig into another head-scratcher from Genesis 1. The timeline of creation itself. Specifically, we're going to look at the concept of the 6 days of creation and how that aligns, or doesn't, with what we know about the universe. This isn't just about nitpicking details, it's about asking how an ancient story lines up with what science has uncovered about the origins of everything around us. Genesis 1 lays it out very clearly, 6 days each with specific acts of creation followed by a day of rest. But here's the big question. What's a day in this context? Is it a literal 24-hour period as some interpretations claim, or is it something more symbolic, like epoch or stages? Let's break this down. The text repeatedly says, "There was evening, and there was morning," which definitely makes it sound like a regular day-night cycle. But here's the twist. The sun, which governs our understanding of day and night, doesn't show up until day 4. So how are these first 3 days being measured without the sun? The entire concept of a day is meaningless in any literal sense. This brings us to an even bigger issue, the age of the earth and the universe. According to Genesis, everything was created in a single week. Contrast that with what science tells us. The universe is around 13.8 billion years old, and Earth itself is about 4.5 billion years old. The 6-day timeline feels impossibly cramped when you can consider the vast, sprawling timeline revealed by geology, astrophysics, and biology. It's like trying to fit an entire symphony into a single measure of music. Sure, it's dramatic, but does it make sense? Let's talk specifics. Day 3, for example, involves the creation of land and vegetation. Plants are said to sprout up across the earth before the sun even exists. Think about that for a second. Plants which rely on photosynthesis, a process that literally cannot happen without sunlight, are thriving on a sunless planet. Is this some kind of miraculous workaround? Or is it simply a storytelling oversight? And there's the sequence itself. According to Genesis, the earth is formed first, and then the stars and other celestial bodies are created later. But here's the catch. Modern science tells us the exact opposite. Stars, including our sun, formed billions of years before planets. In fact, the elements that make up Earth were forged in the hearts of stars that exploded long before our solar system even existed. Day Fired brings another fascinating layer to this puzzle, the creation of sea creatures and birds. Now birds are described as being created alongside fish. But evolutionary biology paints a very different picture. Birds are actually descendants of dinosaurs, which appeared long after fish had already dominated the oceans for hundreds of millions of years. It's not just a small mix-up. It's an entirely different timeline. The kicker comes on day 6, when all the land animals and humans are created. According to Genesis, humanity appears in a single, dramatic act of divine creation. But what about the evidence we have from fossils, genetics, and anthropology? Human beings didn't just pop into existence fully formed. We're the result of millions of years of gradual evolution, tracing our lineage back through primates, mammals, and even earlier forms of life. The idea of humans as a sudden, final creation feels completely at odds with everything we've learned about our own origins. What makes this all the more intriguing is how Genesis' timeline doesn't just conflict with science, it also conflicts with itself in subtle ways. Take the mention of land animals in day 6. Animals are created alongside humans, but in Genesis 2, man is created first, and then animals are formed to keep him company. Which is it? Were humans the grand finale, or the starting point for everything else? Even the idea of 6 days raises questions about the nature of time itself. The Hebrew word for day, yom, can mean a 24-hour period, but it can also refer to a longer, indefinite period of time. If yam is symbolic, then maybe these 6 days are actually vast stretches of cosmic history. But if that's the case, why does the text go out of its way to describe evenings and mornings? It's like the story is trying to have it both ways, and it's not quite pulling it off. Now let's zero in on one of the most compelling parts of Genesis 1, the creation of human beings. Specifically, let's talk about how humanity's debut in the biblical narrative aligns with, or clashes with, what science tells us about our origins. Spoiler alert, the differences aren't small. Genesis 1, verses 26 and 27 says, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock, and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.' But let's unpack this claim and see how it holds up under scrutiny. First off, let's address the phrase 'in our image.' What does that even mean? Does it refer to physical appearance, moral capacity, intelligence, or something else entirely? The text doesn't say. But what's fascinating is that this idea of humans being created in the image of God stands in stark contrast to the scientific understanding of human origins. Science doesn't place us on a divine pedestal. Instead, it traces our lineage through a long and complex evolutionary process that ties us to every other living organism on Earth. From single-celled organisms to fish, amphibian mammals, and finally primates. Our story is one of shared ancestry, not divine exclusivity. Genesis 1 suggests that humans appeared fully formed in a single act of creation, but the fossil record tells a very different story. It shows us a gradual development over millions of years with early human ancestors like Australopiths and Homo hero paving the way for modern Homo sapiens. These weren't sudden leaps. but incremental changes shaped by natural selection. The idea that humanity just popped into existence skips over all of that fascinating and well-documented history. Let's also talk about timing. Genesis places humans right at the end of the creation timeline, as if we're the grand finale. But in reality, modern humans have only been around for about 300,000 years, a blink of an eye compared to the Earth's 4.5 billion year history. For most of Earth's existence, there were no humans, no mammals, and sometimes no life at all. So the idea that humanity is the purpose of creation feels a little off when you consider just how late we arrived on the scene. Then there's the idea of dominion. Genesis describes humanity as having authority over all other living things, but this doesn't exactly line up with how ecosystems work in nature. Humans aren't the sole rulers. We're participants in a complex web of life. Everything from bacteria to apex predators plays a role in maintaining ecological balance. The notion that we're somehow separate from or above this system ignores the interconnectedness of all life on Earth. Here's another curveball. Genetic modern science has shown that all humans share a remarkable amount of genetic similarity, not just with each other, but with other species as well. Did you know that we share about 98 to 99% of our DNA with chimpanzees? And even with bananas, we've got about 60% of the same genetic material. These connections suggest a shared evolutionary history, not a special one-off act of creation. The Genesis account, however, skips over all of that and presents humans as fundamentally separate from the rest of the animal kingdom. And let's not forget to cuss. And let us make mankind in our image, who is us. The text doesn't clarify, and interpretations vary wildly. Some say it refers to the Trinity, others to a divine council. And some even suggest it could be remnants of older polytheistic tradition. Whatever the case, it's a curious phrase that raises more questions than it answers. Now let's bring in anthropology for a moment. Genesis paints humanity as a unified group right from the start. But archaeology and genetic studies show that early human populations were anything but unified. Early humans spread out across the globe in small, isolated groups, adapting to their environments in diverse ways. This is why we see such a wide variety of cultures, languages, and physical traits today. Genesis simplifies this incredibly complex history into a single narrative, which compelling doesn't match up with what we know. One final thought. The Genesis narrative doesn't mention anything about the billions of other species that came before humans, dinosaurs, extinct megap, or entire ecosystems that thrived and vanished long before we showed up. Not a word. It's as if the story starts with humanity already in mind, which might make sense for a human-centric worldview, but doesn't align with the broader history of life on Earth. Let's dive into another fascinating detail in Genesis 1, the creation of animals, specifically. We're going to explore how the biblical account of animal creation stacks up against what we know from science and evolutionary biology. Genesis 1, verses 20 to 25 gives us a sequence that's simple, straightforward, and wildly at odds with reality. The text describes God creating sea creatures and birds on day 5, followed by land animals on day 6. On the surface, it sounds like a logical progression. Water-dwelling creatures, then air-dwelling ones, and finally the land dwellers. But once you scratch the surface, the problems start piling up. First, let's talk about birds. Genesis groups them together with fish as if they're part of the same creative act. But here's the thing. Birds didn't just appear out of thin air. They evolved from theod dinosaurs, a process that took millions of years. And here's the kicker. Those dinosaurs were land animal. That means birds didn't come after fish. They came long after. And their ancestors were already roaming the land long before anything resembling a bird took to the skies. So lumping birds and fish together on day 5 is a pretty big miss. Let's not forget about the sheer diversity of sea creatures. Genesis makes it sound like all marine life appeared at once, but the reality is far more complex. Life in the oceans began billions of years ago, starting with simple single-celled organisms. Over time, these evolved into more complex forms. From jellyfish to trilobites, to massive marine reptiles like plesiosaur. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Some of the creatures we associate with the ocean today, like whales and dolphins, actually evolved from land mammals that returned to the water. Genesis doesn't account for any of this intricate back and forth. It's an unshot creation narrative, and that just doesn't match up with the evidence. Now let's move on to day 6 and the land animals. Genesis gives us a broad categorization: livestock, wild animals, and creatures that move along the ground. But this neat little taxonomy doesn't come close to capturing the incredible variety of life on land, from insects to reptiles to mammals. The land is teeming with species that have widely different origins and evolutionary paths. Insects, for example, they're some of the oldest land-dwelling creatures, predating many of the mammals mentioned in Genesis by hundreds of millions of years. And then there's the fact that reptiles, like dinosaurs, dominated the earth long before mammals ever showed up. None of this complexity is reflected in Genesis 1. Another fascinating wrinkle is the timeline. Genesis suggests that all these animals were created in a matter of days, but the fossil record tells a different story. Land animals didn't just appear overnight. They emerged slowly over hundreds of millions of years, with early amphibians paving the way for reptiles, which in turn gave rise to mammals. This gradual progression is completely absent from the biblical narrative, which compresses everything into a single day. And then there's a question of extinction. Genesis doesn't mention anything about the countless species that have come and gone over Earth's history. Dinosaurs, for example, ruled the planet for over 160 million years before being wiped out by an asteroid. Their extinction paved the way for mammals to rise to prominence, and eventually for humans to appear. But in Genesis, there's no room for this kind of turnover. It's as if all the animals that ever existed were created at once and have remained unchanged since then. That's not just inaccurate, it's a massive oversimplification of life's history. Now let's talk about something really intriguing: the order of creation in Genesis versus the evolutionary timeline. Genesis puts fish and birds first, followed by land animals. But evolutionary biology tells us a different story. Fish did indeed come first, but birds came much later as descendants of dinosaurs. Meanwhile, many land animals, including amphibians and early reptiles, appeared long before anything resembling a modern bird. So the biblical order doesn't just simplify things, it outright reverses the sequence in some cases. And what about insects? There are some of the most successful creatures on Earth, with millions of species and a history that dates back over 400 million years. Yet they don't even get a mention in Genesis. Were they considered too insignificant? Or were the authors simply unaware of their existence? Either way, it's a glaring omission, especially when you consider how vital insects are to the ecosystem. Without them, many plants wouldn't be able to reproduce, and entire food chains would collapse. But Genesis gives us no indication of their importance, let alone their origins. Genesis 1 has been interpreted through the ages, specifically how theologians and scientists have clashed, sometimes explosively, over its meaning. Genesis 1, verse 31 is often viewed as a poetic declaration of divine creativity. But here's where things get spicy. Some insist it's not just poetry, they argue it's literal history. Think about the term day in Genesis. The original Hebrew word here is yom. Now yom can mean a 24-hour day, or it can mean a longer undefined period. Some theologians argue that it represents epochs, vast stretches of time. They claim this harmonizes Genesis with modern geology and cosmology. Sound neat, right? But here's the catch: that interpretation only came about after science started proving the Earth wasn't 6,000 years old. It feels a little like reverse engineering the Bible to fit the facts. Let's take this a step further. The creation account claims that the earth, oceans, and life were all created in a set sequence. But what happens when we compare that to the fossil record? In Genesis, plants appear on day 3, long before the sun and stars on day 4. Yet science tells us plants couldn't have existed before the sun because, well, photosynthesis is kind of a non-negotiable for plant life. This inconsistency makes you wonder if the 6-day sequence was ever meant to be taken literally, or if it was just a convenient framework for storytelling. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. Some theologians proposed the framework hypothesis. They argued Genesis 1 wasn't written to explain how creation happened, but why it happened. According to this view, the days are symbolic, representing God's sovereign ordering of the universe. Sounds profound, right? But it's not without problems if the days are purely symbolic. Then what parts of Genesis are meant to be literal? Adam and Eve, the flood. Where do you draw the line between metaphor and history? For those who stick to a literal interpretation, the battle with science is oh no. One of the biggest sticking points is the age of the Earth. Radiometric dating of rocks, ice core samples, and starlight traveling billions of light years all tell the same story. The Earth and universe are incomprehensibly old. Yet a literal reading of Genesis suggests an Earth only a few thousand years old. To counter this, some creationists propose that God created the universe with the apparent age, that everything was made to look old. But doesn't that raise another question? Why would a supposedly truthful God design a universe filled with evidence pointing to a completely different timeline? Now, let's bring in the cultural context of Genesis. Father have noted that its structure mirrors ancient, no Eastern creation myths. B, for instance, the Babylonian Enuma Elish describes God organizing the cosmos from chaos, just like in Genesis. This doesn't mean the Bible plagiarized Babylonian myths, but it suggests the writers of Genesis were operating within a shared cultural framework. They likely shaped their narrative to reflect their unique theological vision. One God creating everything in order and harmony, as opposed to a pantheon of squabbling deities. Genesis might not even be trying to tell us how the universe came to be. Instead, it could be making a theological statement. that God is sovereign, the creator of all, and distinct from the gods of other cultures. But that brings us full circle to our problem. If Genesis wasn't intended to be literally history, how did it end up being interpreted that way by so many? Let's peel back the layers of Genesis 1 and see it for what it might really be, of a product of its time. That's right. The creation story that billions have come to see as divine revelation might just be an ancient remix of older myths. Imagine an ancient Israel, a tiny kingdom surrounded by powerful neighbors like Babylon and Assyria. These cultures had their own stories about how the world began, and some of them sound subtly familiar. Take the Enuma Elish, a Babylonian creation myth. In this story, the god Marduk defeats a chaos dragon named Tiamat and uses her body to create the heavens and the earth. Chosen to order sound familiar. Genesis doesn't feature a dragon-slaying battle, but it does start with God taming formless chaos. The earth was formless and empty. Coincidence? Maybe not. Scholars argue that the authors of Genesis borrowed themes from their neighbors, but gave them a monotheistic twist, instead of many gods bickering and fighting. Genesis shows one God calmly creating the universe with the power of His word. It's like the writers of Genesis were saying, look, our God doesn't need a battle. He's in control from the start. Here's another parallel, the 7-day structure. In the Enuma Elish, the gods create the world over a series of steps, and the climax involves the creation of humans to serve the gods. Sound familiar again? Genesis also has a structured creation process ending with humans, but it flips the script. Instead of humans being servants, they're given dominion over the earth. That's a bold rebranding of an old idea. And it's not just Babylon. Ancient Egypt had its own creation myths that emphasized the divine ordering of chaos. In one Egyptian myth, the god Adam creates the world out of watery chaos. Much like the waters described in Genesis 1, verse 2, the parallels are striking, and they raise a fascinating question. Was Genesis ever meant to be unique? Or was it just another take on a shared cultural narrative? Let's pause for a moment. Think about how ancient texts were written and shared. These weren't isolated stories penned in a vacuum. They were shaped by cultural exchanges, oral traditions, and the political realities of the time. The writers of Genesis were likely well aware of these other myths, and they crafted their story to reflect their distinct beliefs about God and humanity. But here's the kicker. This cultural borrowing doesn't necessarily diminish the significance of Genesis. Instead, it adds another layer of complexity. It shows how deeply interconnected human cultures have always been. What Genesis does, and as brilliantly, is take these shared ideas and frame them in a way that sets the Hebrew God apart. No squabbling pantheon, no chaotic violence, just divine order and intentionality. Of course, this perspective might not sit well with everyone. For those who see Genesis as divinely dictated and wholly original, the idea of cultural borrowing can feel threatening. But for others, it's a reminder that sacred texts are products of their time, shaped by human hands and reflective of the world they came from. Thank you for sticking with me through this exploration of Genesis 1. Whether you're here out of curiosity, skepticism, or a burning desire for answers, I'm glad you joined me. Don't forget to leave a comment below. I want to hear your thoughts, your questions, and even your argument. Let's keep the conversation going, because this is just the beginning, And hey, if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. There's so much more to uncover, and I can't wait to take this journey with you. See you in the next one.